The first stirrings of defiance often begin quietly, in places where no one expects a spark to ignite. For me, it began in the smokehouse, the sharp tang of salt and curing meat filling my lungs, the rhythmic scrape of my knife against the cleaver providing a steady cadence to my thoughts. Every cut, every precise movement, was both work and meditation, a silent rehearsal for plans I barely dared to articulate, even to myself. I had long since learned that survival in the Blackwell plantation required observation above all else. The eyes of a slave must always be open, the ears attentive to conversations not meant for our understanding, the mind always cataloguing, storing, assessing. It was during these quiet hours that I began collecting snippets of information, small pieces of a larger puzzle. How slaves, careful not to draw attention, whispered rumors of Master Gregory's declining fortunes, his erratic behaviors, and the fading influence of his father, whose management had kept the plantation functioning despite the cruelty it demanded. I listened closely, noting the shifts in patrol schedules around the perimeter, observing which neighbors were rumored to favor abolitionist sympathies, and cataloging minor oversights by the overseers, Puit included, that could be turned to our advantage. These observations, mundane though they seemed, were threads. When woven together, they could create a map to freedom. Master Gregory had changed, though few recognized it fully. The death of his wife 2 years prior had begun a subtle deterioration, a softening of the once imposing figure into a man brittle and unpredictable. His drinking increased, his patience frayed to the point where even the smallest infraction among the slaves earned harsh punishment. Yet his cruelty was inconsistent, almost distracted at times, leaving gaps in his vigilance that could be exploited. Puit's disappearance, sudden and unexplained, accelerated Gregory's instability. The overseer had been both a tormentor and, strangely, a stabilizing presence. Without him, Gregory floundered, making poor decisions and revealing more of himself than ever before, unguarded and vulnerable. As the days passed, I sharpened not only my knives, but my understanding of the landscape around me. I memorized patrol patterns, noting when guards were likely to be absent, the times when the main house lights dimmed, and the rhythms of work that offered moments of privacy. Conversations overheard in the kitchen, the laundry yard, or the stables became critical intel, each phrase a potential key to freedom. And through it all, I maintained the facade expected of me. The dutiful butcher, meticulous in my trade, humble in my demeanor, quiet enough not to attract suspicion. Yet beneath this calm exterior, something was stirring. The act of planning, of imagining escape, began to reshape me. I was no longer merely a man existing under oppression. I was a strategist, an architect of possibility. Each small step, each piece of gathered knowledge, fed a growing certainty that our liberation was achievable. I began to see the plantation not only as a place of confinement, but as a chessboard. Each guard, each overseer, each poorly maintained fence a piece to be maneuvered, to be turned against its master. My thoughts often returned to the night of Puit's disappearance. There was a lesson in that event, a brutal illustration of the consequences of underestimating those you oppress. I did not dwell on the fear, but on the potential. Puit's absence had shifted the balance of power subtly, creating opportunities that had been impossible while he roamed unchecked. And though Master Gregory's suspicion had not yet focused sharply on me, I knew that time was a luxury I could not afford. Observing, planning, gathering, it was necessary, but action would eventually be required. I began small, mapping the safest paths through the woods, cataloging sympathetic neighbors, distributing modest amounts of Puit's hidden wealth among those I trusted. Each act reinforced the sense that something larger was at work, that freedom was no longer a dream but a tangible goal, attainable through patience, precision, and courage. The seeds had been planted, and with each passing day they took root in my mind, preparing me for the moment when observation would give way to action. The first real test of courage often comes unannounced, striking not when one feels prepared, but when the circumstances leave no room for hesitation. For me, that moment arrived in the smokehouse on an otherwise ordinary evening in early April. The aroma of curing meat hung heavy, mingling with the faint tang of whiskey that seemed ever present on Master Gregory's breath. I was finishing the day's work, arranging cuts of pork and beef with meticulous care, when I sensed movement at the door. Master Gregory stepped in, his presence unsteady, as if the weight of the past and his own failings had pressed him into the floorboards. His usually pristine clothing was rumpled, his face flushed, blood vessels broken across his cheeks, the telltale marks of drink evident in the slight sway of his stance. His eyes, red-rimmed and unfocused, fixed on me with a predatory curiosity. "So you know something, don't you, Butcher?" He slurred. About Puit. I did not flinch, my hands continuing their work with the same precision I had maintained for years. My expression was neutral, offering no hint of the thoughts that swirled behind my eye. Master Gregory stepped closer, boots leaving muddy tracks on the floor, the smell of alcohol thickening the already heavy air. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist with a strength I had not anticipated. Pain lanced through me, but I did not react. The lesson learned from years of survival held firm. Fear is a tool, but restraint is armor. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, boy," he hissed. I raised my eyes carefully, meeting his but revealing nothing. His proximity allowed me to smell the whiskey on his breath, to see the fragility beneath the facade of authority. "Something isn't right here," he continued, "and I aim to find out what it is." Puit wouldn't just leave, not without his horse, his belongings. His fingers tightened painfully around my wrist. "If I discover you had anything to do with his disappearance, I'll make what he did to you seem like a mother's caress." The shove that followed sent me backward against the workbench, but I recovered quickly, maintaining the calm that had become my shield. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, the muddy prints he left behind a testament to his intrusion. That encounter, brief yet heavy with menace, crystallized the stakes. Master Gregory's suspicion, fueled by drink and desperation, was a genuine threat. If it were to focus fully on me, the facade I had carefully constructed could crumble in an instant, and with it my life would hang in the balance. The first spark of active resistance, however, is rarely a sudden blaze. It begins as a quiet determination, an understanding that observation alone is no longer enough. Over the following days, I intensified my efforts, speaking privately with Isaiah, whose literacy and intellect made him an invaluable partner. Through him, we established contact with a sympathetic Quaker farmer whose land bordered Blackwell Plantation. We mapped escape routes, identified patrol schedules, and discreetly distributed funds to those who would need resources along the way. Each act was small in isolation, but together they formed a latticework of possibility. My exterior remained that of the obedient, specialized slave, the quiet butcher, grateful for the modest privileges afforded to me. Inside, however, I was changing. I was no longer simply a man surviving. I was becoming a strategist, a leader, a planner of freedom. The events of the past, the cruelty of Puit, the erratic menace of Master Gregory, had forced me to grow beyond the identity imposed on me by birth and circumstance. The realization of agency, even in a constrained environment, is transformative. It reshapes not only actions but perception. I began to see the plantation not merely as a site of oppression, but as a landscape full of patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. Each guard rotation, each moment of oversight, became a potential step toward liberation. The smokehouse, once a sanctuary and a prison, became a command post, a place from which I could plan, calculate, and envision a future where chains were no longer part of daily existence. That week marked the transition from passive observation to intentional action. The spark had been lit, subtle and quiet at first, but persistent. Each decision, each clandestine conversation, each careful mapping of escape routes fanned it into a flame. The first spark of rebellion is rarely dramatic in appearance, but it burns relentlessly in the mind of the one determined to seize freedom. And so I prepared for the journey that would demand every ounce of cunning. The days that followed Master Gregory's drunken intrusion were filled with a peculiar tension. I moved through the quarters, the smokehouse, and the fields with a calm that belied the storm of thoughts within me. Each conversation I had, each glance I exchanged with a fellow slave, was measured. The outward performance of the obedient butcher remained flawless. My hands were steady, my voice neutral, my demeanor unassuming. But in the quiet moments, when no eyes were upon me, my mind raced, mapping, analyzing, and preparing. Isaiah became my indispensable partner. His literacy, painstakingly acquired in secret, was a resource few could claim and fewer still dared to exploit. Together, we transformed scraps of paper, whispers, and observations into tangible plans. We noted the patrol routes with precision, recording the times and tendencies of the overseers and guards. Local farmers who were rumored to sympathize with abolitionists were discreetly approached, their willingness to assist cautiously confirmed. Every piece of information, no matter how small, became a thread in a growing tapestry of potential escape. Puit's disappearance continued to cast a shadow over Blackwell Plantation. While rumors swirled among the white families and overseers, none suspected that the butcher of the smokehouse had orchestrated the event. I maintained the facade of calm, continuing my work with the same meticulous attention that had earned me both favor and a measure of trust. Every day I walked the delicate line between subservience and the careful orchestration of liberation. The planning was not merely logistical, it was psychological. I had to ensure that those who would follow understood the risks, but also felt the possibility of freedom. Fear was omnipresent, yet I needed courage to take root. Conversations with Isaiah became exercises in strategy and morale. We discussed contingencies for every conceivable obstacle: river crossings, patrol encounters, sudden illnesses, and the inevitable moments of exhaustion that could cause hesitation. Our discussions were measured, careful, but increasingly infused with the quiet certainty of purpose. I also began the careful distribution of Puit's money. The golden notes, once hidden within the smokehouse and near my work area, were apportioned to trusted companions. Some were to be used to purchase essential supplies, others to secure safe passage, and a portion reserved as a hedge against unforeseen circumstances. Even the smallest amounts were life-saving if used wisely, and every decision about allocation required deliberation. A single misstep could compromise the entire operation. Yet amidst all the planning and preparation, I remained the butcher. Each morning I sharpened my knives, inspected the meats, and performed every task with methodical precision. My outward identity was my armor, allowing me to navigate a world designed to suppress and observe. Every swing of the cleaver, every slice of cured meat, became an exercise in maintaining that illusion. I could not afford to falter, not even for a moment. The first spark of rebellion had become a slow, deliberate burn. A quiet, relentless flame. I spent hours walking the edges of the property at night, imagining the journey north, memorizing the patterns of the forest, the locations of streams, and the subtle markers that would guide us. Each step was a rehearsal, a mental preparation for the moment when action would finally replace planning. I knew the importance of patience. Impulsiveness was a luxury I could not afford, and yet the emotional weight of the task was ever present. I felt the responsibility of lives resting in my hands. Every person I guided, every route I charted, every secret whisper to an ally carried the potential for success or catastrophe. The reality of what we were attempting, escaping from bondage, defying centuries of oppression, was not lost on me. Freedom demanded calculated courage, and courage demanded that I carry the burden of others as well as my own. By the end of that week, the plan had matured. Safe routes had been confirmed, allies had been identified, provisions were ready, and contingencies were accounted for. The group that would follow would be nearly half the plantation's population, each person a vital piece in the unfolding strategy. The careful planning, quiet patience, and meticulous preparation had set the stage for what was to come, the journey that would define the rest of our lives. In the smokehouse, under the dim lamplight, I paused to consider the transformation within myself. No longer merely a butcher, I had become a strategist, a leader, and a custodian of hope. The knives that once shaped meat would soon serve as instruments of survival. The knowledge and skills honed through years of labor were now tools for liberation. And within that quiet resolve, I felt the unmistakable pulse of purpose, a certainty that the time to act was approaching, and when it came, nothing could deter it. The night chosen for our departure arrived with a darkness so complete that it seemed to absorb even the faint glimmer of stars above. A moonless sky stretched over Blackwell Plantation, casting the familiar fields, quarters, and forest edges into a shroud of shadow. Every sound carried weight. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of an owl, the faint clatter of a loose shutter swaying against its frame. The air was thick with anticipation, a mixture of fear, hope, and the palpable tension that only accompanies acts of rebellion. I moved quietly through the quarters, ensuring that those who were to follow were awake, prepared, and aware of their precise roles. Groups were small, consisting of 2 or 3 individuals at a time, to minimize attention and avoid drawing the gaze of overseers or patrols. Each slave carried the provisions we had gathered over weeks of careful preparation. Dried meats from the smokehouse, parcels of cornmeal, water skins, and the maps painstakingly copied by Isaiah. Every step, every whisper was deliberate, controlled, measured. The meeting point, a clearing deep in the woods marked by a lightning-struck oak, had been chosen for its strategic advantages. It lay beyond the reach of casual patrols, accessible only through narrow paths that could be defended or abandoned with minimal risk. The oak itself was a silent sentinel, a landmark whose presence had become a symbol of the impending journey. We would converge there, hidden beneath its branches and undergrowth, before moving north under the cover of night. As the first small group slipped from the quarters, I remained behind, performing a final check of the smokehouse and its surroundings. Each shadow was scrutinized, each sound evaluated for potential threats. The responsibilities of leadership weighed heavily on me. One misstep, one careless action, could unravel the plan and condemn dozens to punishment or death. Yet beneath the anxiety, a calm determination settled in my chest. Every detail had been considered, every contingency accounted for. By the time the last group departed, the clearing was nearly full. 23 souls, nearly half the population of Blackwell Plantation, had assembled in the dense cover of trees and underbrush. Faces were pale but resolute, eyes wide with fear and anticipation. Children clung to the hands of elders, trembling but obedient, guided by whispered reassurances and the quiet confidence that I project. Every person present understood, at least in part, the magnitude of what we were attempting. A break from the bonds that had confined us, a march toward uncertain freedom, and a defiance of centuries of oppression. I was the last to leave the quarters, carrying a pack that contained the remaining provisions and my butcher's knife, an extension of my own hand honed over years of labor. The forest seemed alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, masking our passage as we moved with calculated stealth. My heart beat in measured rhythm, not from fear alone, but from the awareness that the culmination of weeks of preparation rested entirely upon the success of this night. Halfway to the oak, I sensed movement in the shadows, unmistakable, deliberate. Master Gregory emerged, his figure illuminated by the dim light of a lantern, a shotgun cradled in his arms. His eyes, bloodshot and wide, reflected both surprise and suspicion. "I knew it," he slurred, voice thick with drink. "I knew you were involved in something. Planning to run, are you, butcher?" Every decision I had made led to this moment. My outward composure was a mask, concealing the meticulous calculations running through my mind. Distances, angles, and possible reactions were assessed in the fraction of a heartbeat. The odds were heavily against me, yet hesitation was a luxury I could not afford. "Where are the others?" he demanded, gesturing with the shotgun. His steps crunched against fallen leaves, each echo a threat. "Don't bother denying it. I saw them leaving. Ungrateful wretches, all of you. My father will have you hunted down." I said, "Your father is dying," I replied calmly, speaking as an equal for the first time. "And you're drinking yourself to an early grave. This plantation is failing, Master Gregory. You know it as well as I do." His face contorted with rage. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'll kill you where you stand, and you'll have lost the most valuable slave on this plantation," I countered, voice steady. "Who will prepare your meat then, Peterson?" The man can barely tell a ham from a shoulder. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. Even in his drunken state, he recognized the logic of my argument. The shotgun wavered slightly. "Tell me where they're going," he demanded, voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Tell me, and perhaps I'll be merciful." "Just a whipping for you," I offered, stepping forward carefully. "And we'll bring the others back with minimal damage. I can show you. It's not far. They're waiting for me before moving on." Suspicion warred with greed in his eyes, but ultimately the prospect of recovering his property prevailed. "Lead the way," he commanded, gesturing with the shotgun. Every movement was deliberate, every word carefully measured. I had orchestrated this confrontation with precision, turning his assumptions against him, setting the stage for the liberation that lay just beyond the clearing of trees. The convergence at the lightning-struck oak was complete, and the night of reckoning, when planning would give way to action, had finally arrived. The clearing beneath the lightning-struck oak was a nest of shadows, whispers, and taut nerves. 24 figures crouched among the undergrowth, eyes darting to every movement, ears straining for the faintest signal of pursuit. The moonless night wrapped us in its cloak, yet no darkness could conceal the weight of anticipation. Children huddled close to elders, their soft breaths warm against chilled skin, eyes wide with both fear and awe. Adults whispered last-minute reminders and reassurances, each voice trembling but determined. I took stock of every individual, ensuring that no one was missing, that provisions were distributed equitably, and that every map and parcel was accounted for. Isaiah stood beside me, a silent sentinel, eyes scanning the perimeter with an alertness born of fear and literacy. the latter a tool that had proven invaluable in decoding the labyrinthine paths north. The forest itself seemed to lean in, listening to our movements, as if aware that history was about to be rewritten by the steps of the fugitive. Once satisfied, I signaled for the first group to move. Small figures slipped into the blackness of the woods, carefully following the narrow paths I had memorized. Each step was deliberate, cautious, yet resolute. No sounds were allowed beyond the whisper of feet against soil and the occasional rustle of a branch. Panic was a danger as lethal as any overseer or patrol. Discipline had to be absolute. Hesitation could cost lives. I was the last to leave, carrying my pack of preserved food, maps, and my butcher knife. The weight of the knife was familiar, almost comforting. It had ended lives in the smokehouse, had protected me, and now it symbolized a tool of survival rather than cruelty. The journey through the forest was grueling. Roots caught at our feet, unseen dips threatened to fall, and shadows played tricks on our eyes. Yet every step forward was a defiance of centuries of oppression, a tangible act of liberation. Roughly half an hour into the march, I sensed movement ahead, not animal but human. My heart stilled, every nerve braced for recognition. Master Gregory emerged from the shadows, staggering slightly under the influence of alcohol, a shotgun cradled in his arms. His face, pale under the faint starlight, betrayed a mixture of triumph and suspicion. "I knew it," he slurred, voice rough with drink. "Planning to run, are you, Butcher?" "Calm and precise," I responded. "Where are the others?" His eyes narrowed, scanning the dark forest, the faint outline of the escaping slaves visible if one knew where to look. "Don't bother denying it. I saw them leaving. Ungrateful wretches, my father will have you hunted down." "I said your father is dying," I replied evenly, "and you're drinking yourself into an early grave. This plantation is failing, Master Gregory. You know it as well as I do." Rage contorted his features. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'll kill you where you stand." "And you'll lose the most valuable slave on this plantation," I countered. "Who will prepare your meat then, Peterson? The man can barely tell a ham from a shoulder." Even in his drunken haze, he faltered. Logic pierced through anger. The shotgun wavered slightly. "Tell me where they're going," he demanded. "Tell me, and perhaps I'll be merciful." "Just a whipping for you," I said carefully. "And we'll bring the others back with minimal damage. Follow me. They're waiting before moving on." Suspicion battled greed, but greed won. He gestured with the shotgun. "Lead the way." I led him through narrow trails, our footsteps muted by the damp earth. Every movement was deliberate. Calculated, the others waited at the clearing, tension coiling around them like a living thing. Master Gregory's anticipation made him careless, eager to recover his property, unaware that each step brought him closer to the reckoning I had planned. As we neared the clearing, the first glimpses of the assembled group became visible. The moonless night, the rustling forest, and the dense shadows masked our numbers until the moment was right. Master Gregory, eyes wide with desire and greed, pushed forward, shotgun training. This moment was the opening I had orchestrated for weeks, the convergence of preparation, patience, and timing. I adjusted the grip on my knife, a measured calm settling over me. My body knew what to do, instincts forged from years of butchery and necessity. Every step, every gesture was precise. The path to freedom lay just beyond that clearing, and nothing would divert the course we had set. As he stepped into the clearing, the plan transitioned from preparation to execution. This night was no longer a test of patience or courage. It was the moment when planning became action, when survival demanded precision and decisiveness. The night of escape had arrived, and with it, the culmination of every strategy, every sacrifice, every heartbeat of resistance that had led us here. The moment was upon me with the inevitability of the tide. Master Gregory, swaying slightly from drink and greed, had followed my careful lead into the clearing beneath the lightning-struck oak. His eyes gleamed with anticipation, entirely focused on the sight of his fleeing property, unaware that his own end had been drawn into the very path he pursued. My hand rested lightly on the knife concealed in my sleeve, fingers tracing the familiar contours of its handle. Every muscle in my body poised for precision. This was no act of anger, no spontaneous vengeance. It was the execution of weeks of calculation, the careful alignment of timing, circumstance, and will. The clearing was alive with tension. The other fugitives crouched low, their breaths held, hearts beating in unison with mine, though none fully comprehended the role I was about to play in their freedom. For them, the night had been a test of endurance and courage. For me, it had become a test of resolve, of the ability to act decisively when hesitation could cost more than life. It could cost liberty itself. Each step Master Gregory took drew him closer to the precipice of reckoning. Each shuffle of his boots over fallen leaves, a drumbeat heralding justice long deferred. When he moved past me, eyes wide and fixed on the clearing where our companions waited, the opportunity crystallized. The shotgun, momentarily lowered in anticipation, gave me the angle I needed. Every motion had to be flawless. There would be no second chance. I stepped forward, knife in hand, the cold metal an extension of years of labor and restraint, and drew it across the side of his neck. The sound, a strangled gasp followed by a wet gurgle, was muffled by the dense forest, yet it resonated within me with profound gravity. Master Gregory stumbled, eyes wide with disbelief, hands clawing at the wound I had delivered with surgical precision. "This is for every lash," I whispered softly, the words meant for his ears alone. "For every humiliation, every family torn apart, every child born into bondage on your land." He struggled to speak, a wet, hopeless sound escaping, seeking comprehension, seeking a reason. Why? Not merely why kill him, but why now, when escape had been nearly complete? The answer was clear to me, because no man should profit from owning another. No master, no overseer, no agent of cruelty could be allowed to claim dominion over life itself without consequence. I held him upright only long enough to witness the light fade from his eyes, to see the certainty in death mirrored in his wide, questioning gaze. There was no cold detachment, as there had been when I ended Puit's life. This was different. An assertion of justice beyond personal vendetta. It was the balancing of scales that slavery had skewed for generations. Nature, not I, would claim him now. I dragged his body deeper into the woods, ensuring it would be removed from the path of my companion's flight. Unlike Puit, whose body had been fed to the Hogs, Master Gregory's body would return to the earth, a silent testimony to the consequences of cruelty, a warning to those who might continue his legacy. The clearing remained tense. The fugitives, aware that my silence and calm were deliberate, made no move to question or intervene. Some of them may have suspected, some may have feared, but none spoke. Isaiah's eyes met mine briefly, a mixture of concern and understanding passing between us. Certain burdens, I knew, could not be shared. Not now, not in this fragile moment between enslavement and freedom. We pressed on, leaving the clearing behind. The forest swallowed our tracks, the dense underbrush concealing the passage of 24 souls determined to claim freedom. Each step away from the clearing was a step into a new identity, a reclamation of the agency that had been denied for so long. I was no longer merely Solomon the butcher, the man whose skill had been confined to the processing of animals. I was now Solomon the liberator, architect of a journey that would become legend, not for the brutality of its methods alone, but for the audacity of its aim, freedom for the oppressed. As we moved northward, the forest echoed with the soft whispers of the night, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Every sense was alert, every instinct tuned to survive. We knew the journey was far from over, that danger lingered in every shadow, that pursuit by slave catchers could erupt without warning. But the most immediate and profound threat had been neutralized. Master Gregory's death, precise and purposeful, had removed the final obstacle within our immediate path. We did not celebrate, not aloud. Relief was measured in silent exhalations, in the quiet, careful movements that carried us deeper into the forest. The night had demanded decisiveness, skill, and courage. It had demanded acts that weighed heavily upon conscience, yet were necessary for the survival and liberation of 24 human beings. As we vanished into the shadows, I carried with me a knowledge both sobering and empowering, that freedom exacts a price, that justice may require acts beyond common morality, and that the path to liberation is rarely simple or clean. The Ohio River loomed ahead like a dark, liquid barrier between bondage and liberty. Its surface, gleaming under a quarter moon, seemed deceptively calm, betraying none of the currents that had claimed the lives of many who had attempted to cross without guidance. The fugitives, 24 souls bound by desperation and hope, paused at the riverbank, each measuring the distance with eyes wide, hearts pounding. Fear was a tangible presence, brushing against the necks of the weary travelers, reminding them that freedom demanded more than courage. It demanded cunning, endurance, and at times ruthlessness. The ferryman, a free black man whose reputation for aiding escaped slaves had preceded him, was nowhere in sight. Signs of his abrupt departure lay scattered along the bank. An overturned kettle, a hat forgotten in haste, and hoofprints leading inland. Isaiah, ever vigilant, knelt to examine the tracks, his face shadowed under the moonlight. "Slave catchers," he whispered. "They must have intercepted him." A chill rippled through the group. Without the ferryman, crossing the swollen river would test even the strongest among us. We had little choice. Turning back was unthinkable. To hesitate would risk discovery by the patrols now surely combing the shoreline. Our eyes scanned the riverbank downstream until Micah, one of the strongest field hands, spotted a flatboat moored nearly half a mile away. Likely abandoned by a farmer, it offered the only feasible means of crossing without immediate confrontation. Yet it was chained to a tree, padlocked and left to the elements. The task of freeing it, navigating its ungainly bulk, and guiding the entire group across in silence and darkness was monumental. I took stock of the flatboat, noting its dimensions, the strength of the current, and the distribution of the group's weight. The padlock resisted at first, but a twist of the butcher knife between the hasp and chain broke the lock with a muted crack. Every sound was a threat, every shadow a potential betrayal. We moved the boat upstream toward the waiting fugitives, careful to remain hidden from any eyes that might track our efforts. The night air was thick with anticipation, each step weighted by the enormity of the task before us. Loading the boat required precision and strategy. The craft sat low, barely above the waterline, threatening to capsize with each added passenger. Strong hands distributed weight, while the elderly and children were positioned at the center to maintain balance. The current seized the flatboat immediately, dragging it faster than anticipated, forcing me and Isaiah to plant the long poles against the riverbed with every ounce of strength. The river tested us relentlessly, its power threatening to undo weeks of preparation in moments. Halfway across, the first disaster struck. A submerged log caught the edge of the boat, tipping its sloshing water over the sides. Panic flared. Children cried. Adults clung to the edges, and a pole slipped from Isaiah's grasp, swept into the current. I shouted directions above the roar of the water, urging everyone to hold fast, to trust the rhythm we had established, to survive as one body despite fear and exhaustion. Every motion was measured, every command delivered with clarity and urgency. Then came the sound we had dreaded, the baying of hounds from the Kentucky shore. The slave catchers had tracked our crossing. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, a stark glowing threat in the darkness. Isaiah's voice, tight with tension, confirmed our fear. They found us. If they bring boats, we won't outrun them. Desperation lent strength to my arms. The currents could not best my resolve. The urgency could not overcome my discipline. We steered toward a bend where fallen trees created a natural barrier, promising a precarious safety. The flatboat collided with the tangle of submerged branches, jarring the group but providing leverage to grab hold. Hands scrambled for branches, pulling the craft closer to shore. I ensured the children and elderly were first, while the adults helped one another with gritted determination. Isaiah's careful planning ensured the group moved efficiently, though the panic behind us drove a harsh urgency. Behind the tangle, the lanterns drew closer, the river alive with pursuit. I stayed on the boat until the last of the fugitives had scrambled onto the shore. Then, alone, I released the craft from its entanglement and maneuvered it toward the oncoming slave catchers. Their small boat, illuminated by the single lantern, advanced rapidly. They did not immediately recognize that I was alone, that my approach was deliberate. I waited until they were within striking distance before using the flat boat to ram their vessel. Chaos erupted. The rifle discharged harmlessly, the men toppled, and the river claimed their balance. In swift succession, I engaged them with the knife, precise and unhesitating. 3 lives were ended to secure the freedom of 24. When the violence ceased, I scuttled both boats, ensuring they sank without a trace, then swam to the northern shore to reunite with our group. Relief mingled with exhaustion as the fugitives recognized the sacrifice that had secured their passage. We moved quickly into the forest, aware that dawn would bring renewed danger, but buoyed by the knowledge that the first major barrier to freedom had been conquered. The Ohio woods stretched before us, dense and unyielding, a labyrinth of shadows and tangled undergrowth that offered both refuge and peril. The air carried the scent of spring thaw, wet earth mingling with the sharp tang of decaying leaves. Every step reminded us that the freedom we had seized at the river's edge was precarious. The pursuit might have been halted for the night, but the hounds and men on the Kentucky shore would not abandon their quarry lightly. Each rustle, each distant crack of a branch could herald discovery or doom. Isaiah led the way, map clutched in his hand, eyes scanning the terrain with unwavering attention. His literacy, honed in secret years before, had become an invaluable asset, allowing us to anticipate obstacles and chart courses through hostile territory. I walked alongside him, shoulders squared, senses heightened. Behind us, the group moved in silence, a fragile chain of human resolve, tethered together by necessity and mutual dependence. The children, exhausted but resilient, clung to their parents or older siblings, their small hands gripping tightly, as though letting go might undo the escape entirely. For the first few miles, our journey was haunted by echoes of the river, the adrenaline from the crossing still thrumming through our veins, mingling with exhaustion. We were alive, yes, but every step forward carried the weight of our mortality. We encountered fallen logs, hidden bogs, and swift creek crossings, each requiring careful coordination to prevent tragedy. I often found myself scanning for natural barriers or vantage points where we could rest while remaining unseen. Isaiah, ever watchful, kept us on the narrow paths least likely to attract attention, guiding us towards sympathetic farmsteads rumored to shelter fugitive slaves. Night after night, we navigated by the stars, the North Star a constant sentinel above us, a guide both literal and symbolic. The darkness was our ally, masking our movements, yet it demanded vigilance. Fires were forbidden, the smallest glow a beacon for bounty hunters. Hunger gnawed at us, though I rationed the preserved food I had prepared with careful calculation, ensuring that no one went completely without. Every ration represented a lifeline, a small act of defiance against the deprivation we had endured for so long. Along the journey, we encountered those willing to assist, Quakers who offered discreet shelters, black farmers who provided food, and occasional travelers who guided us through the trickiest segments of terrain. Each encounter was an exercise in trust and subtlety. We could not know which stranger might be a friend or foe, and every interaction carried the risk of exposure. Yet in these acts of human kindness, small but profound, we glimpsed the solidarity that sustained fugitives. Like ourselves across state lines, tension never fully abated. Every distant sound, the barking of a dog, the clatter of a wagon, the occasional cry of an owl, sent our group into immediate alert. My mind remained sharp, anticipating ambushes, potential pitfalls, and the exhaustion that threatened to erode our discipline. The fugitives looked to me not just for direction, but for reassurance, a steadfast presence capable of making hard choices in moments of acute danger. Leadership was no longer a role assumed lightly. One evening, as we skirted the edge of a Quaker settlement, rumored to aid freedom seekers, we were forced to hide in a dense copse of trees while a patrol passed nearby. The adults hushed their children, pressing them close while I kept watch, knife in hand, muscles coiled with tension. The patrol lingered longer than expected, their lanterns swinging like ominous pendulums, illuminating glimpses of the ground where we crouched. Not a word was spoken, not a single movement made that might betray our presence. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely until the danger finally passed, leaving only the rapid thudding of our hearts to mark its presence. Sleep, when we allowed ourselves even moments of it, was brief and restless. Our bodies demanded rest, yet the mind remained tethered to survival, scanning the shadows for threats. Morning brought little relief. Daylight revealed the harsh landscape we had to traverse, the rivers and ravines and farmland where freedom could be snatched away in a moment. Each day was a careful balance of urgency and caution, moving swiftly enough to avoid lingering in one location too long, yet not so recklessly that exhaustion would cripple us. Throughout the journey, I spoke to the group of purpose. We are not property, I reminded them nightly. Not tools for profit or instruments of cruelty. We are human beings, claiming what is ours by right, not by favor. These words, simple yet profound, became our mantra, a steadying force against fear and doubt. Slowly, as miles and nights passed, the physical journey intertwined with a psychological one, transforming us from fugitives into a unit bonded by resolve and shared destiny. Ohio was merely the threshold. Danger remained, relentless and unpredictable, but with each step, each careful maneuver, we moved closer to the true promise of freedom that awaited us across the Canadian border. Crossing into Michigan marked a pivotal shift in our journey. The Ohio River, with its currents and dangers, lay behind us, yet the weight of vigilance remained. Michigan offered a tenuous sense of security, a land where the reach of slave catchers was diminished but not eliminated. Every mile northward was a step further from immediate danger, yet freedom demanded more than survival. It required adaptation, resourcefulness, and trust in those willing to help. We arrived at the outskirts of Detroit under the dim veil of dawn, weary from our ordeal on the Ohio River. The city, with its modest buildings and bustling streets, seemed at once alien and liberating. For many in our group, it was their first sight of a northern urban environment, a place where black people, free or fugitive, could move with less fear than in the plantations of the South. We kept to the shadows, navigating alleyways and back roads, seeking out the network of safe houses established by local abolitionists. These hidden sanctuaries were essential lifelines, providing food, clothing, and a brief reprieve from the constant pressure of pursuit. Our first stop was a modest home, owned by a free black family who had lived in Detroit for decades. Their hospitality was measured but sincere. We were allowed to rest, to wash away the grime and blood of our flight, and to partake of simple food that nourished both body and spirit. Children huddled in corners, exhausted yet curious, while adults took the opportunity to tend minor injuries, mend clothing, and restore their strength. The families spoke little of themselves, careful not to draw attention, but the quiet compassion in their gestures was unmistakable. Here, we experienced the first taste of what freedom could feel like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of agency, the ability to act for oneself without the shadow of ownership looming over every decision. I took the opportunity to observe, to learn, and to plan. The journey northward had taught me that survival was inseparable from preparation. We could not rely solely on the goodwill of strangers. We needed resources, knowledge, and contingency plans. I spoke privately with Isaiah, discussing routes further north, the locations of sympathetic Quaker communities, and potential work opportunities that could sustain us during the coming months. Every choice carried consequences, and inaction was as dangerous as miscalculation. Detroit proved to be a crossroads, a temporary haven that also presented new challenges. The city was teeming with refugees from the South, some openly seeking work, others hiding in plain sight. Rumors of bounty hunters moving north created a pervasive tension. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in the street, was met with caution. Yet despite the constant vigilance, a sense of solidarity began to emerge. Free blacks, fugitive slaves, and abolitionist allies formed a fragile but enduring community. We shared news, resources, and encouragement, reinforcing the bonds that would sustain us during the precarious months ahead. I found work in a modest slaughterhouse on the city's outskirts. My skills as a butcher, honed under the brutal discipline of Blackwell Plantation, became an instrument of survival and dignity. The owner, a white man who recognized competence and efficiency above all else, treated me with a grudging respect. The work was grueling and the wages modest. Yet for the first time in my life, my labor was my own. There was no overseer's whip, no auctioneer's call, no claim over the fruits of my effort. I could earn, spend, and plan freely. The rhythm of honest work, though exhausting, anchored me in a new reality. Freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. Within our group, bonds deepened. Isaiah's literacy became a cornerstone of communication and planning. He wrote letters, copied maps, and maintained discreet correspondence with allies further north. The children, now slightly rested, began to exhibit curiosity and resilience that had been suppressed under slavery. Parents shared stories of survival and hope. I realized that leadership required more than command. It demanded empathy, foresight, and the ability to inspire confidence when the path ahead was uncertain. We moved cautiously, never lingering longer than necessary, but the temporary security of Detroit allowed us to recalibrate. Some among our group chose to remain, establishing new lives in the city. Others, driven by the knowledge that true freedom lay across the border, pressed on with Isaiah and me toward Canada. For all of us, these days in Michigan were a testament to the fragile balance between safety and progress, a lesson in trust, resilience, and the enduring human desire for liberty. By the time we departed, fully rested and provisioned, we had become more than fugitives. We had become a community united by shared struggle and purpose. The journey north would continue, each step a testament to the courage and ingenuity required to claim a life that had been denied to us by birth and circumstance. Michigan offered shelter, solidarity, and a brief reprieve, yet the ultimate challenge still lay ahead, crossing the final threshold into Canada, where freedom would no longer be conditional but absolute. The approach to the Detroit River marked a threshold in our journey, both literal and symbolic. Every mile north had been a battle of endurance, wit, and courage, but the river represented the final barrier before the sanctuary of Canada. Its dark, glimmering surface reflected both the moonlight and the weight of anticipation pressing upon our group. We had survived plantations, patrols, and treacherous rivers, Yet this crossing carried the added urgency of finality. Beyond these waters lay a land where the law could not reach for our capture, where we could finally shed the identities imposed upon us by slavery. We reached the riverbank late at night, guided by whispered instructions from a network of abolitionist contacts who had mapped safe crossings. The air was heavy with spring moisture, the scent of wet earth mingling with the river's tang. The group gathered silently, assessing the situation. Children clung to their parents and adults exchanged nervous glances. Isaiah, ever vigilant, surveyed the scene and confirmed the absence of patrols along the nearby shore. Yet absence did not guarantee safety. The river's current was swift, and the night offered no quarter for error. We had been advised of a ferry operated by a free black man, who routinely assisted fugitive slaves. Yet upon arrival, there were only signs of hasty departure. An overturned kettle, a hat left on the bank, and hoofprints leading toward the woods. The ferry was gone, likely intercepted by slave catchers, a grim reminder that danger remained omnipresent. Fear rippled through the group. Crossing without the ferry would be perilous. Several of the elderly and the youngest, including little Thomas, would struggle to navigate the river's width. We had no choice but to improvise. Micah spotted a flatboat a short distance downstream, likely left by a farmer for transporting goods. Its presence was a providence of sorts, though it required careful handling. I quickly assessed the lock securing it. With a twist of my butcher knife, honed through years of precision, I forced the padlock open. The sound was muted, but every heartbeat was loud in the tense silence. Once freed, we dragged the boat upstream to a concealed point where the group could safely embark. Each step required coordination and stealth. There was no margin for error. Loading the flatboat demanded careful planning. Its shallow draft made it susceptible to tipping, especially under the combined weight of 24 souls. Adults lifted the children distributed weight evenly and braced themselves for the river's pull. Isaiah and I took up the long poles, our only means of propulsion and control. The water immediately claimed our attention. The current was swift, dragging us downstream, forcing every muscle into action, testing the limits of our endurance. The boat lurched against submerged logs, threatening to capsize, sending splashes over the sides and eliciting cries of fear. The sound of baying hounds reached us across the river. Slave catchers were close, their pursuit relentless. Fear transformed into a sharpened clarity. I gave precise instructions. Hold on to the poles, redistribute weight as needed, and maintain silence. Panic could undo everything we had fought to achieve. The children whimpered, but Isaiah's calm guidance reassured them. Each pole's strike against the riverbed became a pulse of determination, each movement a calculated act of survival. We navigated to a natural bend in the shoreline, where fallen trees created a semi-barrier. "Grab hold," I commanded. "Get to the shore, no matter what." The group obeyed, climbing over slippery branches, pulling each other through the tangled mass of wood. I stayed on the boat until the last child had crossed safely. Then, spotting the small boat of slave catchers approaching, I acted decisively. Taking the flatboat back into the current, I steered toward them deliberately, allowing their overconfidence to be their undoing. The collision was violent. The catcher's craft tilted, water poured in, and rifles discharged harmlessly into the night. Seizing the moment, I leaped aboard, knife in hand. The confrontation was brief but brutal. 3 men, driven by greed and expectation, fell to the precision and desperation of one who had long faced death as an inevitability. When the last struggle ended, I scuttled both boats, ensuring no trace remained. Emerging onto the northern shore, I reunited with the group moments before dawn. Relief was palpable, yet unspoken. The journey had tested our courage, our resolve, and our unity. Every face bore exhaustion, fear, and a newfound sense of possibility. We had crossed the Detroit River, leaving behind the immediate threat of American laws, the hands of captors, and the shadows of enslavement. Canada awaited, not just as a geographic destination, but as a promise of life unclaimed by oppression. Though exhaustion weighed heavily, we pressed on toward the inland settlements, guided by maps, instincts, and the North Star. Each step was a reclamation of autonomy, each breath a defiance of the chains that had sought to define us. The river had been the crucible, and we had emerged not merely as survivors, but as people who had seized the right to live on our own terms. In that moment, freedom was no longer abstract. It was tangible, immediate, and irreversible. The first steps onto Canadian soil carried a weight unlike any we had previously experienced. It was not merely the relief of crossing the Detroit River. but the sudden, almost shocking awareness that the laws of slavery no longer governed our lives. Every glance, every gesture, and every decision belonged solely to us. Freedom, once a distant dream whispered in the dark, was now tangible. Yet the reality of survival in Windsor, Ontario, brought immediate challenges. Shelter, food, and work awaited, and unlike the regimented brutality of plantation life, nothing was guaranteed. We pressed onward from the riverbank under the dim light of pre-dawn, winding through wooded paths to avoid detection. The network of abolitionists that had assisted us north of Ohio extended into southern Canada, providing temporary housing and guidance. A sympathetic black farmer offered his barn for the day, allowing us to dry our drenched clothing and gather our strength. The children, exhausted from the river crossing, slept fitfully on straw, their small forms curled against each other for warmth. Isaiah moved among them, quietly offering comfort and instruction on what lay ahead. Work was scarce in Windsor, and the economic reality of freedom quickly became apparent. Despite this, we found a small community of black and mixed-race settlers, many of whom had also escaped slavery. They welcomed us with cautious optimism, sharing news of available work, the layout of the town, and which areas were safest for newcomers. I recognized in their eyes a mixture of hope and wariness. They had known freedom longer than we had, but the shadows of the United States still loomed large. Among them, I was recognized not for my notoriety in Kentucky, but for my skills as a butcher, a trade I had honed under the oppressive scrutiny of masters, yet one that now offered the promise of autonomy. Finding employment at a local slaughterhouse, I was initially met with suspicion by the white owner. My skill, however, quickly proved indispensable. Precision, speed, and reliability earned grudging respect. I received wages for my labor for the first time in my life. Every coin was a statement. This was my work, my body, my effort, not property to be claimed by another. I could choose how to spend it, how to plan my days, and even how to refuse work when necessary. For the first time, the notion of consent was real. Isaiah, too, found opportunity, helping other refugees adjust to Canadian life. His literacy became an invaluable resource as we navigated bureaucracy, found housing, and connected with other escapees. Together, we helped organize food deliveries, located temporary shelters, and established contact with families still en route from the south. Our group, once bound by fear and shared escape, now became a support network, a community of survival and rebuilding. Yet freedom brought new trials. The climate was harsher than Kentucky. Winters were long and biting, food supplies fluctuated, and accommodations were often cramped and uncomfortable. We could not rely on a master's provision or an overseer's predictable schedule. Every day demanded initiative, foresight, and cooperation. Despite these hardships, there was a profound sense of dignity in being accountable only to ourselves. Every small victory, a steady wage, a warm meal, a dry bed, was a triumph of autonomy. News from the United States arrived sporadically, carried by travelers and the underground network. We learned of continued resistance, the deaths of former masters, and the persistence of systemic oppression. Yet these reports, while sobering, underscored the importance of the choices we had made. Our escape had not only secured our own freedom, but had contributed, in however small a measure, to a larger narrative of defiance. The story of Puit and Master Gregory lingered in my memory as a reminder of justice exacted against cruelty, and a cautionary tale that had inspired both fear and respect. Over time, I established a modest home on the outskirts of Windsor. Small as it was, it became a sanctuary, a place where decisions were minor. I maintained close contact with Isaiah's extended family, sharing resources, teaching skills, and guiding newcomers through the perils of early settlement. The absence of overseers, the whip and auction blocks, brought a freedom that extended beyond the physical. It demanded responsibility, endurance, and vigilance. Freedom was not the absence of challenge, but the power to confront it on one's own terms. The first year of life in Windsor was one of adaptation, learning, and cautious optimism. Each day carried the dual weight of gratitude and awareness. Gratitude for the liberty we had seized, and awareness that the road north had not ended, but transformed into the ongoing challenge of sustaining life in freedom. Yet through these trials, I discovered the depth of my resilience, the value of community, and the irrevocable significance of having claimed a life not as property, but as a human being capable of shaping his own destiny. Settling into Windsor brought with it not only the relief of safety, but the weight of responsibility. Freedom, while sweet, was demanding, and survival required constant effort. The community of escaped slaves, free blacks, and sympathetic allies had grown, and with it the need for leadership and coordination. Every new arrival from the South carried the burden of trauma, fear, and uncertainty. Our role was not merely to welcome them, but to teach, guide, and prepare them for life, where they were accountable for every action. I took it upon myself to share skills I had mastered under the brutal regimen of slavery. Butchery, once a means of survival under oppressive hands, became a tool for economic independence. I taught the craft to willing apprentices, demonstrating precision, cleanliness, and efficiency. Each cut of meat, each correctly prepared joint, was not just sustenance but a lesson in autonomy. To many, it seemed strange that one who had once labored under a master's whip now found purpose in teaching others to cut, cook, and provide for themselves. Yet it was a reclamation of power, a redirection of skills that had once served oppression toward life and independence. Isaiah became my right hand in this endeavor, his literacy allowing us to navigate legal documents, write letters for those who could not, and communicate with sympathetic contacts both near and far. Together, we created an informal network of aid, shelters, food deliveries, safe passages, and introductions to employment. We guided families to secure work, advised them on navigating Canadian regulations, and cautioned them about the dangers of venturing too close to the U.S. border, where slave catchers still lurked. Our vigilance was constant. Freedom did not guarantee safety, only the ability to choose when and how to defend it. Community life was layered with both joy and sorrow. Weddings were celebrated with vigor, as families who had been torn apart in the South were united, often for the first time in years. Children learned to run, to speak freely, and to imagine a life unshackled by fear. Yet grief remained, as many had lost parents, siblings, and friends to the unforgiving reach of slavery. Each story shared around the fires or in humble homes was a testament to resilience. In these moments, I saw clearly the purpose of the sacrifices we had made, to ensure that these lives could flourish unbound by chains, even as the ghosts of the past lingered. Economic survival was no small matter. Jobs were often hard to come by, and wages were meager. Many struggled to feed themselves and their families, particularly during harsh winters. We pooled resources when possible, creating a rudimentary safety net. Flour, salt, dried meat, and firewood were shared with those in need, and in return we received labor, guidance, or shelter. Each transaction reinforced the bonds that held the community together, transforming survival into collective strength. It was a rhythm of interdependence that contrasted sharply with the cruel hierarchies of the plantation. The shadow of the United States remained ever present. Rumors of continued slave hunts and recapture attempts reminded us that freedom was precarious. Each winter, when the ice thickened on the Detroit River, I feared that some might attempt crossings back to the United States for work or family, risking capture. Our vigilance extended beyond immediate survival. We worked to instill awareness, resilience, and caution in every newcomer. Freedom required constant mindfulness and careful strategy. Lessons learned from years of running, hiding, and outwitting those who sought to reclaim us. As the years progressed, our settlement became a hub for communication and assistance. Messages sent via abolitionist networks connected us to Detroit, Buffalo, and even New York. We offered temporary housing for those fleeing peril and guidance for families seeking permanent relocation. I often reflected on how far we had come since that first night on the Ohio River. 24 desperate souls navigating dark waters and dense forests, driven by hope, now transformed into a community capable of offering support to others in equal measure. Through it all, I nurtured a sense of dignity, not just for myself, but for the community at large. I emphasized the importance of education, literacy, and skill building. Children were encouraged to read and write, and adults were urged to learn trades that could provide sustainable livelihoods. The wounds of slavery were deep, but knowledge and autonomy could heal them in part. Freedom was not merely a condition of law. It was an ethic, a practice, a way of life that demanded effort and awareness. In these efforts, I discovered a profound truth. The fight for freedom extended far beyond escaping bondage. True liberation required community, preparation, and the cultivation of resilience in every individual. We had survived chains, overseers, and the constant threat of death. Now, survival itself became a form of resistance, an assertion that humanity could thrive when nurtured, educated, and respected. The lessons we had learned through terror and necessity were repurposed to build something enduring, a society founded on cooperation, vigilance, and the unshakable belief in the value of human life. With each passing year, as the urgency of survival lessened and the rhythm of settled life took hold, I found myself reflecting more often on the meaning of justice and the legacy we were creating. The world I had entered upon reaching Windsor was not perfect. Far from it. Racism, prejudice, and systemic inequality persisted, even in Canadian soil. Yet within the small circle of freed individuals, we had the opportunity to shape society differently, to model what dignity, mutual respect, and resilience could look like. I had lived through cruelty unimaginable to most, had wielded life and death in a fight for survival, and had seen the raw power of fear and oppression. With that experience came a responsibility to guide others toward justice that was measured, principled, and enduring. I often thought of Puit and Master Gregory, of the lives I had taken, and of the countless others whose suffering had been invisible to history. These reflections were never accompanied by pride or vengeance. They were reminders that justice in a world governed by cruelty often required decisions that defied conventional morality. The killings on the Ohio River, the calculated elimination of threats, had been acts born of necessity, but also of moral clarity, a refusal to allow human beings to dominate and exploit others without consequence. In the quiet moments, I acknowledged the weight of those acts and the burden of carrying them alone, understanding that true liberation demanded moral courage alongside physical action. As Windsor's community grew, I became increasingly aware of the legacy we were forging for the generations that followed. Children born free, yet raised on stories of chains and cruelty, needed guidance to reconcile the trauma they had inherited with the opportunities they now possessed. We worked to instill in them a sense of moral responsibility, to honor the struggles of the past, not with resentment or vengeance, but with wisdom, empathy, and courage. Freedom was a living practice, and our collective actions, both big and small, shaped the moral foundation on which future generations would build. Education became a cornerstone of our community. Isaiah and I taught literacy not merely as a practical skill, but as a means of empowerment. Reading and writing offered access to knowledge denied under slavery, a tool for critical thinking, and a shield against manipulation and exploitation. Those who mastered literacy could record their own stories, defend themselves legally, and engage in commerce with confidence. Each letter written, each book read, became a small act of reclamation, a defiance against the centuries of enforced ignorance that had been a pillar of the slave system. Justice extended beyond individual acts to community organization. We established informal codes of conduct, emphasizing fairness, mutual aid, and accountability. Disputes were resolved through dialogue, with elders providing counsel rather than punishment. Assistance was given to those in need, without expectation of repayment. Yet contributions to the community's well-being were recognized and valued. These practices, rooted in principles of shared humanity and respect, created a model of society that contrasted sharply with the hierarchical oppression I had known in Kentucky. I also understood that our legacy required vigilance beyond our immediate community. Stories traveled, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly. The legend of the Butcher of Kentucky persisted, whispered among those who had once wielded power over slaves, a cautionary tale of retribution and the consequences of cruelty. Though mythologized, the tale carried a kernel of truth, a reminder that the oppressed could assert agency even in the darkest circumstances. It was a story I never recounted in full, but its existence reinforced a broader understanding of justice, that actions taken against oppression could resonate far beyond the initial act, shaping perceptions and behavior across time and place. As I aged, the physical limitations of the body became increasingly apparent, but my mind remained alert, attuned to the subtleties of human behavior and the needs of the community. I took solace in mentoring younger leaders, sharing insights gleaned from a life forged in adversity. I encouraged them to approach freedom not as a static state, but as an ongoing endeavor, one requiring courage, strategy, and empathy. Each success, each life lifted from the shadow of oppression, was a testament to the endurance of human dignity. Ultimately, I came to understand that the measure of justice was not found solely in acts of vengeance or survival, but in the lasting impact of choices that empowered others. Every lesson taught, every life guided, every barrier overcome, contributed to a legacy that transcended my personal story. Freedom, I realized, was inseparable from responsibility. The responsibility to act ethically, to protect the vulnerable, and to ensure that the struggle of the past informed the promise of the future. In these reflections, I found a sense of peace. The smokehouse at Blackwell, the bloody nights on the Ohio River, the perilous journey north, all were threads in a larger tapestry. Each decision, each act of courage or calculated risk, had led to a community rooted in freedom, education, and mutual respect. The echoes of our choices would continue long after my voice fell silent, shaping lives in ways I could only begin to imagine. In that awareness, I embraced the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing one has acted not merely for oneself, but for the enduring welfare of others. The first winter after our arrival in Canada was unlike anything we had experienced. The northern cold, sharp and unrelenting, cut through even the thickest layers of clothing and reminded us that freedom, though liberating, carried its own set of hardships. Unlike Kentucky, where the sun lingered long enough to temper frostbite and frozen ground, the Canadian snow blanketed the earth with a merciless weight, silencing the forest in a white hush. Our small group, once bound tightly by the urgency of escape, now faced the daily task of survival in a world that demanded constant adaptation. We quickly realized that freedom did not absolve one from struggle. Food was scarce, and hunting in a new environment required patience, skill, and sometimes luck. Gathering firewood became a near obsession, for without heat, illness could strike swiftly, and children were most vulnerable. The lessons learned under duress on the Kentucky plantations now took on a different form. Efficiency in movement, economy of resources, and vigilance in assessing risk. We could no longer rely on hidden paths or sympathetic neighbors alone. We had to create structures of self-sufficiency that would sustain us throughout the bitter months ahead. Employment was a necessity, not merely for survival, but for establishing our independence. I found work in a modest slaughterhouse on the outskirts of Windsor. My skills as a butcher, once a tool of survival under the gaze of cruel masters, now provided dignity and stability. The owner, a practical man, cared little for my past. He measured my worth in the precision of cuts and the cleanliness of the work. The wage was meager, barely enough to cover basic necessities. Yet every coin represented autonomy, a rejection of the system that had once claimed my labor as property. With each paycheck, I could purchase coal for heat, bread for the children, and fabrics to patch worn clothing. Money, the smallest unit of freedom, became a tangible measure of the life we had claimed. Even as we adapted to these material demands, the mental challenges persisted. The shadows of our past haunted every moment of quiet. Memories of beatings, whippings, and the faces of those left behind at Blackwell reminded us that freedom was a fragile state. The risk of returning slave catchers lingered in our minds, and the stories that accompanied our flight north were a constant reminder of the danger that once threatened our lives. Each decision, from where to travel to whom to trust, had to be weighed with care. Every choice carried consequences, and the mistakes of the past could not be undone. Community became our anchor. Isaiah and I worked not only to ensure the physical well-being of our group, but also their mental resilience. We gathered regularly, sharing stories, teaching reading and writing, and emphasizing the principles that had carried us through danger: cooperation, vigilance, and dignity. Children, many of whom had been born into slavery or were too young to remember it, required particular care. They needed reassurance that this new world, though harsh, was a place of possibility. Education, discipline, and empathy formed the foundation upon which they could grow without fear. These efforts, small in daily practice, became the legacy of our collective freedom. The harsh climate also tested our resourcefulness. We learned to insulate our shelters with straw, to ration food carefully, and to rely on neighbors, both black and sympathetic white, for temporary assistance. Illnesses, particularly respiratory infections, spread rapidly in the close quarters of winter homes. We became skilled in basic medical care, treating fevers, coughs, and frostbite with what little we could procure or improvise. Each success, each life preserved through careful attention and ingenuity, reinforced the value of freedom. It was not merely the absence of chains, but the ability to care for oneself and others with autonomy. As the months wore on, the harshness of winter taught lessons that no journey south to north escape could have imparted. Freedom demanded endurance, creativity, and collective effort. It was a state that required as much mental discipline as physical fortitude. And yet, for all the hardships, there was a profound satisfaction in self-reliance, in waking each morning knowing that our lives were ours to direct, that our children could grow unbound by the fear of auction blocks or overseers' whips. Through the coldest days, I often reflected on the irony that freedom, which had cost us so much blood and risk, now demanded a new kind of struggle, one of survival against nature and circumstance rather than human cruelty. And yet, I would not trade it for the comfort of chains. Every frostbite-numbed finger, every sleepless night tending the sick or shivering by the fire, was a testament to the enduring value of the liberty we had carved from the shadows of oppression. In this winter, I understood clearly that freedom was not an endpoint but a beginning. The beginning of sustained effort, careful planning, and collective responsibility. It was here, amid the snowdrifts and the bitter winds, that the foundations of our Canadian community solidified. A community that would thrive on resilience, courage, and the unyielding belief that every soul deserved to live as a free human being. As the years passed, I came to realize that freedom was only the beginning of a far more intricate journey. Canada offered refuge, yes, but it did not erase the scars carried from decades of enslavement. Nor did it shield us from the prejudices and inequities that lingered even in a land that had abolished slavery. Every small act of survival, finding work, securing shelter, educating children, was a conscious defiance of the forces that had sought to claim our lives and our spirits. The cost of liberty, I discovered, was perpetual vigilance, the constant cultivation of autonomy and resilience. I dedicated myself to building a life that honored both the memory of those left behind and the courage of those who had escaped alongside me. Isaiah became more than a companion. He was family, confidant, and co-architect of our community. Together, we guided newcomers through the first, precarious steps of freedom, teaching them to read maps, secure employment, and navigate a world that could still be hostile despite legal sanctuary. Our home, small though it was, became a hub of refuge and counsel, a place where whispered stories of the South gave way to practical lessons in survival, dignity, and self-determination. The legend of Blackwell Plantation and the stories of Puit and Master Gregory remained part of the collective consciousness. Among our circle and in whispers beyond, the tale of the butcher who defied his masters persisted, not as a mere act of vengeance, but as a symbol of justice, meted in a world that had none. I rarely recounted the details. Some truths were too heavy for the ears of those untested by such brutality. Yet, the cautionary story inspired caution among those who would consider perpetuating cruelty, and hope among those who sought liberation. It reminded every listener that oppression could be resisted, that even the most entrenched systems of power could be challenged when one refused to remain silent. I never married. My focus was on the survival and growth of the community around me, on nurturing those who would carry forward the lessons of courage, vigilance, and self-respect. The children became my unofficial legacy, each one a living testament to the power of endurance and the value of freedom earned at such a high cost. In teaching them, I felt a connection to all the generations whose labor, suffering, and rebellion had built the path we now walked. They represented both the continuity of struggle and the hope that future chains might never be imposed. Time inexorably began to weigh on me. The body, once strong and disciplined from years of toil, now betrayed me in small but persistent ways. My hands, skilled in the precision of the butcher's craft, ached in the cold. My breath became shallower, and the relentless work of managing daily survival became more taxing. Yet my mind remained sharp, recalling each lesson from Blackwell, each calculated step from Kentucky to Canada, each decisive act that had ensured the lives of those who escaped with me. Reflection was both a comfort and a burden. I measured the balance of lives taken and lives saved, of suffering endured and freedom achieved. In the winter of 1887, as illness overtook me, I felt the weight of my own mortality. Pneumonia, a slow and unforgiving force, began its claim. Isaiah, older yet unwavering in his care, remained by my side, alongside members of his family who had become extensions of my own. In my final hours, the smokehouse, Puit's demise, and the treacherous Ohio River came vividly to mind, not as regrets but as milestones in a life fought fiercely and deliberately. I saw with the clarity that only reflection in the shadow of death can provide, the full arc of my journey from enslaved butcher to free man and guide to others. I spoke to Isaiah quietly, sharing what needed to be shared in those final moments. The understanding that some burdens are best carried alone, yet that courage and resolve could ripple far beyond the individual. Freedom, I reminded him, is not simply the absence of chains, but the active, unceasing affirmation of one's humanity. Those who follow he must teach, must understand that liberty requires vigilance, sacrifice, and the moral courage to act when injustice arises. When my eyes closed for the last time, I left behind a community fortified by experience and bound by the shared pursuit of dignity and survival. The legend of Solomon the Butcher, the tale of vengeance and liberation, would live on, whispered by those who knew its truth and those who adapted it into a symbol larger than life. It was not my story alone, but the story of all who suffered and resisted, who seized the scarce moments of freedom from the jaws of oppression. In death, I joined the countless souls whose names would never enter history books, yet whose actions forged change that resonated far beyond their individual lives. The cemetery overlooking the Detroit River, quiet and unassuming, became the final resting place not only for me, but for the weight of memory, struggle, and triumph. And though my hands would never again carve meat, my life had been a deliberate incision into the heart of tyranny, precise and unyielding, leaving a mark that time could not erase. Solomon the Butcher, escaped slave, guide, and legend, ceased to exist in the flesh, but the truth of resistance, courage, and the unyielding claim to freedom endured. It was a legacy not measured in gold or monuments, but in the continued striving of those who followed, in the teaching of children, and in the quiet, persistent assertion of humanity against systems that would deny it. Freedom, I had learned, is never given. It is carved, earned, and sustained with the sharp edge of resolve.